What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danelle Hallan, and I am back with another true crime video. And as your usual reminder, if you would rather consume this content in podcast form, head on over to any of your favorite podcasting platforms and look up Crime Bit with Danelle Hallan, and all of my content here should be there as well. Now, before I dive into today's case, I need to say a massive thank you to Factor for partnering with me on today's video. Their support helps me to continue doing what I am doing here on my channel, and I am beyond appreciative. If you're not familiar with Factor, they specialize in delivering fresh, never frozen meals directly to your doorstep, crafted by talented gourmet chefs. And as someone who finds themselves ridiculously caught up in a busy schedule between homeschooling my kids and my work, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the convenience that Factor offers. With Factor, I can enjoy delicious, stress-free meals in just about 2 minutes. It's legitimately like receiving a little tiny present every single lunchtime instead of scrambling for takeout or having to use more of my brain juice to come up with my own meal. It's not fun sometimes. It's awesome because you get to choose from a weekly menu of 35 options, and Factor has something for absolutely everyone. Whether you're into keto or protein-packed, calorie-smart meals, you'll find delicious choices that are going to suit your lifestyle. Plus, you have access to a whopping 60 add-ons, you guys, so you can personalize your experience with snacks, breakfast items, or my personal favorite, juices. You can easily adjust your orders, pause them, reschedule deliveries whenever you need, which is a lifesaver for my constantly changing schedule. And if you're someone that enjoys the fancier things in life, they also offer Gourmet Plus meals. You get premium produce like broccolini, which is probably one of my favorite vegetables in the entire world. And I also had filet mignon the other day, and I've spent the entire week trying to figure out how on earth they kept that steak so juicy and tender. None of the foods are dry or tough after reheating them. And Factor is actually now owned by HelloFresh, which you guys know has been a staple in my home since at least like 2018. I absolutely love it. I've used it for years, and I prefer to use HelloFresh for my dinners and Factor for easy-to-go lunches, so they just hit every single mark for me. If you would like to give Factor a try, head on over to factor75.com, or you can click the link down below and use my code 50DanielleHallan to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box, which is a pretty great deal. And I think that after you try it, you will absolutely be hooked. That's code 50DanielleHallan at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Thanks again to Factor. I hope you guys give it a try. Let me know what you think. And now on to the details of today's case. Today, we're going to be speaking about the disappearance of Jermain Charlo, a vibrant 23-year-old Indigenous mother from the Flathead Reservation in Dixon, Montana. And her story, as many of you know, is not just a singular tragedy, but instead a reminder of the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, otherwise known as MMIW. I have covered a handful of MMIW cases that are filled with statistics and information to help you understand why and how these things happen, so make sure that you check out my MMIW playlist to learn more and share a lot of these stories. Germaine's disappearance casts a harsh light on the vulnerability of Indigenous women who face disproportionately high rates of violence and disappearances. And while I do have so many statistics in other videos, as an example, 4 in 5 Indigenous women experience violence, and 1 in 2 experience sexual violence. And their cases often go unnoticed, their stories unheard, their lives undervalued. And in the vast expanse of Montana and beyond, Germaine's vanishing is just an echo of countless other Indigenous women who have met similar fates. This is truly an epidemic. Germaine was last seen on a seemingly ordinary Friday night at a Missoula bar, but as the clock struck midnight, she stepped into the shadows, and it seems like the darkness swallowed her whole. The ensuing search revealed an unfortunately not surprising, disturbing history of domestic abuse, a strained relationship with her ex-partner, and a trail of evidence that ultimately leads to a pretty significant question mark. As the search for Germaine continues, her family and the community refuse to let her be forgotten. They demand answers, they demand accountability, and they demand justice. So let's get into the details of this case. Jermain Austin Charlo was born on April 23, 1995 in Dixon, Montana, a small town nestled within the expansive Flathead Reservation. Now, the Flathead Reservation is home to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and it's more than just a geographical location. The surrounding mountains and the rivers and forests aren't just scenery, but an integral part of the community's identity, shaping their traditions and their livelihoods and their spiritual beliefs. Growing up on the reservation, Germaine was immersed in a very rich cultural tapestry. The reservation was a close-knit community, and like in many Indigenous populations, she was raised closely by several of her family members, especially since her mom gave birth to her when she was just 15 years old, and unfortunately, her father was not an active part of her everyday life. Like so many, Germaine and her siblings faced the harsh realities of witnessing domestic violence, not just against their mother, but other women in their family and in their life. And Germaine seemed to really struggle with this dynamic. She continued living with her mother, but her fears were just magnified by subsequent relationships that caused worry and heartache for her. But while her relationship with her parents was complex, Germaine was also surrounded by such a supportive network of aunts and uncles and cousins who were always there for her, and she seemed to particularly find stability and love in the home of her great-grandparents. Their house was a sanctuary for Germaine, a place where she could express her creativity, explore her passions, and feel a sense of safety and belonging. Germaine's early years were shaped by this very unique blend of beauty and hardships that characterized life on the reservation. And as she grew older, these experiences would shape her into a very resilient and compassionate and determined young woman. And speaking of the kind of person Germaine was, she was described by her family as a sweet and caring soul. Germaine loved animals and without fail always had one following her home, whether it was a pig or a dog or a lizard. It really didn't matter to Germaine. She was more than happy to give them a loving place to stay. She dreamed of eventually having her own farm, a sanctuary for the animals that she loved so much, and even more importantly, for herself. Germaine loved being outdoors. She loved experiencing new things. She spent countless hours exploring, fishing in the rivers. She never took the beauty of her home for granted. And when she wasn't outside, she immersed herself in various creative hobbies. Germaine loved art. She enjoyed drawing and creating. Her Facebook is filled with pictures of different projects that she crocheted and requests for someone to buy her more yarn on a regular basis. She was just such a talented girl with big dreams, like every other person in the world. She wanted to be something, do something. Part of that was hopes of attending the Institute of American Indian Arts in New Mexico. She had so much to look forward to in her future, but she also was experiencing a lot of those same things that many in Indigenous populations do. She ended up in a documented abusive relationship. She went on to have 2 children very, very young and ended up in a very challenging situation that just before her disappearance, she was desperately trying to get her way out of. And so this brings us to mid-June 2018 when Germaine disappeared. On Saturday, June 16th, Germaine's grandmother, Vicky, woke up to find that she had missed a call from Germaine the night before. So concerned, she decided to call Germaine back, but received no response. Vicky continued to call throughout the day, but her silence continued, which was very alarming. It was out of character for Germaine. Being a typical young adult at this point in her early 20s, she was actually 23, Germaine was always on her phone. She always returned calls immediately. So for her to not respond back after hours and hours was starting to worry her grandmother. And a quick check of her social media accounts revealed that she had gone silent there as well. So worried, Vicky began calling around to see if anyone knew Germaine's whereabouts. And one of the first people she decided to contact was Jacob, Germaine's boyfriend that she had been dating for about a month at this point. Jacob was just as worried about Germaine as Vicky was. He said that Germaine had been out and about the previous night at several bars in Missoula, which is the town that he actually lived in. And while he had been out of town that Friday night, Germaine had asked to spend the night at his house since she planned to stay in the area. She didn't want to take the hour-and-a-half drive back home. Jacob told Vicky that he spoke to Germaine around 11:52 p.m. and she said she was at the Badlander bar. Everything seemed fine, but when he called her back at around 1 a.m. to check and see if she had made it to his house safely, something a little unusual happened. Germain's phone rang about 2 or 3 times before he was directly sent to voicemail. And in Jacob's experience, that meant that someone likely had ignored and declined his phone call. And so at that point, Jacob had no way of knowing whether Germaine made it safely to his house or not, and he hadn't been able to reach her since. What he did know is that Germaine hadn't gone out alone that June night. She was actually with a man named Michael DeFrance. Hearing this information, Germaine's family was horrified, and I'll explain to you exactly why. Back in 2010, 8 years before Germaine's disappearance, when she was just 14 years old, Germaine ended up meeting 16-year-old Michael DeFrance, who had just moved in across the street from her house. And according to her friends and family, the two of them very quickly became close. Michael lived with his siblings, his father, who was a tribal member, and his non-tribal mother, and they seemed to have a really solid family unit, which was something that Germaine had just never really experienced, just in the sense of having a mother and father consistently in the home. And so this, I'm sure, was very comforting for her to feel a part of. So Germaine started to spend all of her time with Michael. He loved the outdoors, he loved fishing, so they had a lot of things in common. There was never a dull moment for them. But it wasn't long before Germaine's family started to disapprove of their relationship. Germaine started to do a lot of things that she had never done before that were raising a ton of red flags. For instance, she had started to skip school to spend time with Michael. Michael was apparently homeschooled, and his mom allegedly approached Germaine's mom to try to convince her to do the same for Germaine and her siblings, but obviously that's not a feasible ask for a lot of people. So Germaine's mom, Jennifer, was like, no, can't really get that done. And at that point, Michael's mother allegedly started to just allow Germaine to hide out at their house during the day instead of going to public school. So obviously, Germaine's mom was not happy with that. She stated that she made several attempts to stop this from happening, but Michael's family just wouldn't do anything at all to encourage Germaine to leave their home. And it got to the point that Germaine's mom actually had to call an officer to intervene. But skipping school was far from the only problem or the biggest one. Germaine's family ended up finding inappropriate photos on her phone. And again, she's 14 years old. And they subsequently learned that she and Michael were sexually active. And so by the fall of 2010, Germaine ended up pregnant. Her family at this point was really worried about the life path she was on. So they decided that it would be best to send her to live in New Mexico with her grandparents. They wanted to separate her from Michael. Her pregnancy was terminated. They wanted her to have a fresh start, to regain her focus on all of these goals in life that she had already been so passionate about. And Germaine ended up just flourishing in New Mexico. She loved her new school. She was getting great grades. She loved to spend time with her grandparents, and she was particularly close to her grandmother, Vicky. But she still kept in touch with Michael. And eventually, in 2012, Germaine moved back to Montana. And almost immediately, her relationship with Michael rekindled. And just as before, the concerning pattern continued. Germaine had re-enrolled in school, and she already had several unexcused absences. And according to her family, she started to just spend 80% of her time staying in a camper on Michael's family's property. And she knew that her family didn't really approve of this because she started to lie to them about it. She would claim to be one place with one family member, but instead would really be with Michael. And I'm sure in her eyes, this was an absolute dream. I feel like every kid around that age craves, independence and to make their own decisions. She was living with her boyfriend as if they were on their own. However, it didn't come without a very high cost. By April 13th, 2013, things took a violent turn, at least the first documented incident I had seen. Just after midnight that April night, Sanders County Sheriff's Department responded to the DeFrance home. Germaine told the officer that she had been spending the weekend with Michael alone in this camper, and they had gotten into an argument. I guess she wanted to leave to stay at her grandparents'. She didn't really give a reasoning as to why, but I do know that she grabbed a bunch of her things from the camper, worried that they would be broken, which to me kind of speaks volumes about the situation, and she headed out the door. And she claimed that Michael came out after her yelling. When she continued to walk away, Michael ended up grabbing her, threw her onto the hood of his family's van, held her down, and proceeded to hit her in the face 4 times before throwing her to the ground and spitting on her. This is a terrifying situation. Germaine is only 17 years old at this point. Michael is like 19, maybe 20 years old. This should not be happening. Michael ended up admitting to hitting Germaine. I think he claimed he only hit her 3 times, as if that makes any sort of difference. And obviously, charges did come from this. He ended up being charged with PFMA, or partner family member assault. The officer provided Germaine with several different pamphlets on domestic violence resources and encouraged her to take care of herself. But unfortunately, like so many victims in abusive relationships, Germaine went right back to Michael, even with a no contact order in place. By her 18th birthday, less than 2 weeks after this domestic violence incident, she formally moved out of her family's home and into Michael's camper on his family's property. Michael ended up accepting a plea agreement for these PFMA charges. He pled guilty and he agreed to serve 24 hours in jail along with a loss of firearms for a year. But he was also required to complete 40 hours of domestic violence counseling, focusing specifically on violence, controlling behavior, and dangerousness. However, that did not seem to improve their relationship at all. And now that they were both permanently in the same home, she lived there, it just really continued to get worse. By October of 2013, so not long after this, Germaine ended up pregnant with a little boy. And by the time she was 8 months along, in the summer of 2013, there was another recorded incident. Again, there could have been many things between these two. They just don't have police records to support them. Now, 911 ended up receiving a call and dispatched authorities to Germaine's Aunt Valinda's home, someone that she was very close with. Her Aunt Valinda, I believe, was only 10 years older than her, so they actually grew up more like siblings. Valinda reported to the authorities that she was showering when she heard Germaine calling for help, and so she obviously ran from the bathroom, still in her towel, and ended up finding a visibly distressed, very pregnant Germaine, who was hysterical about an argument she just got into with Michael. And meanwhile, Michael was banging on Valinda's front door. Valinda confronted him to understand what was happening, and he insisted on retrieving a phone that he shared with Germaine. And when Valinda refused, an altercation ensued. According to Valinda, Michael allegedly pulled her out of the house, threw her to the ground, and ultimately fell off balance himself, landing right on top of her. Authorities were able to photograph Valinda's injuries, and then they went to speak to Michael. He said something entirely different. Michael claimed that Valinda had actually been the one to attack him. He said that she jumped on him, wrapped her legs around him, still in her towel, causing them both to fall to the ground, and he even claimed that she pulled a gun on him. It's not really clear if this ever led to any sort of arrest, charges, or a conviction. Just 2 weeks after this, on July 11th, 2014, Germaine gave birth to their first son, and then sometime in 2016, I believe, another little boy was born. So Michael and Germaine now had 2 children together. The years leading up to Germaine's disappearance were filled with these same kinds of troubles. There were numerous similar incidents that occurred, many of them going unreported or resulting in no charges for various reasons. In one case in particular, Germaine actually called the police a day or two afterwards saying she didn't want to press charges on Michael. And despite authorities noting that Michael was present during the call, which could be indicative of coercion, they chose not to pursue the matter further because, unfortunately, if Germaine wasn't willing to testify, the chances of them getting a conviction were slim to none. Officers that responded to these different calls regarding Germaine and Michael said that Germaine did a very typical thing of victims of abuse. She played everything down. She made it seem like it wasn't as big of a deal as it was. She tried to make excuses for Michael, and friends also witnessed this exact same type of behavior typical in abusive relationships. One of Germaine's closest friends said that she would often receive phone calls from Germaine during all of those years, and she could hear Michael screaming in the background, and typically Germaine was asking for a ride out of the situation. But by the time her friend arrived, Germaine would decide not to leave, saying that it was just an accident or misunderstanding, Michael wouldn't hurt her again, and it would be better to stay, a lot less trouble. Her family and friends, everyone that loved her, felt like at this point Germaine was trapped in a vicious cycle that she couldn't escape. A similar experience to so many women in general, and even more so women in Indigenous communities. I speak on domestic violence a lot, and I really try to draw attention to the fact that even in the best of circumstances, even with the most available resources, leaving an abusive relationship is an incredibly dangerous and challenging undertaking. So you can imagine how Germaine felt. She had far fewer resources than the average person to help her navigate this very difficult time. And she was young, she was naive, and she was scared for her 2 children. Germaine's family continued to notice several troubling having issues with Michael. In particular, he started to fixate on Germaine's phone. He allegedly had a history of destroying pretty much any sort of communication, from phones to laptops. And there was one documented incident in particular where Michael actually threw Germaine's phone in a bowl of water, but the officer viewed it as a civil matter rather than an attempt to prevent her from calling for help, which is illegal, and so no action ended up being taken. The controlling nature of their relationship was just wildly apparent to everyone close to Germaine, and she started to try to make attempts to protect herself in different ways. For instance, Germaine had an uncle named Sam who was very close in age and seemed to get along with Michael, and so she regularly invited him over to their home. She believed that having Sam there would create this buffer because Michael would refrain from acting out in his presence, so he kind of became this security blanket for Germaine. But unfortunately, even this strategy occasionally failed her. Sam recounted one instance when he was awakened in the middle of the night by loud noises, only to find the couple wrestling with each other during an argument. Sam mentioned that Michael seemed to feel trapped himself, trapped by the responsibilities of having children at a young age, and unsure if he truly wanted that life. And while it's impossible for me to know exactly how Michael felt, he has never given any interviews, it's evident that neither of them were particularly happy in this relationship. Despite everything, though, Germaine tried so hard to make the relationship work. She likely felt she was just repeating a cycle that she had witnessed in her own childhood. She didn't want that for her children. She didn't want them to witness this violence, but she also didn't want them to go without a father. And so consequently, she endured a lot for the sake of her children. But as time passed, it just became more and more evident how unhappy and lonely Germaine was. She started to create YouTube videos, and she expressed in these videos how lonely she was, that she spent her days just sitting and waiting in this camper for Michael to come home.
Asking why my eyes are so puffy. I've been crying my eyes out because I'm so lonely, which kind of sucks when you're all alone.
And by early 2017, there seemed to be a shift in Germaine, like she was preparing to leave. And this was just a year before she disappeared. She attempted to reach out to social services on the reservation, which was a pretty challenging task because only 2 women were running the program for the entire reservation that spanned 5 separate counties. And that in and of itself is such a crazy thing to me because reservations have such high rates of domestic violence, and all of these women are relying on 2 people to help them. And these 2 people can only stretch themselves so far. And ultimately, they also couldn't do anything for Germaine because Michael was not a tribal member. There's just so many different limitations. Germaine at that point sought help from another organization on the reservation that did assist non-tribal members. And it's believed that they must have offered her some kind of support because from that point on, everything really seemed to change. In April 2017, just before Germaine's birthday, she ended up getting a job as a tree planter with the Tribal Forest Service. And so she was finally going to be making her own money. And a month later, on May 15th, 2017, it all came crumbling down. Germaine made a pretty significant post on social media publicly calling out Michael's behavior for the very first time, at least that I've seen mentioned anywhere. She revealed that she had been a victim of domestic abuse and expressed that she was done with it. That morning, she claimed that asking for a ride and a refusal to give a kiss snowballed into an argument between her and Michael. According to Germaine, Michael went to leave, angry at her, so she pushed him out of the door, and in retaliation, he turned around, shoved her into a pull-up bar, and choked her. Germaine seemed to finally feel emboldened enough and brave enough and strong enough to stand up for herself and stand up for her children. She publicly let the world know what had been happening to her, and ultimately, Michael and Germaine split. And I am sure that immediately Germaine was overwhelmed with this sense of freedom, excitement for the future, finally being out of a situation that was not good for her. But unfortunately, it very quickly became overshadowed by the challenges that often follow an abusive relationship, which first of all is not spoken about enough, and second of all, ironically includes more abuse just in different forms. Germaine confided in her friends and family and social media that Michael had taken the children, and he was essentially using them as pawns in his game. She claimed that he threatened that if she didn't return to him, he would find them a new mother, leaving her completely out of their lives, which I'm sure was such an overwhelming thing for Germaine to hear. And so, under this constant pressure from Michael, Germaine felt compelled to play along with his demands, worried about losing access to her kids, so she reluctantly accommodated him to some extent. So again, you kind of go from one trap right into another. For instance, on May 30th, 2017, despite their separation, Germaine and Michael attended a concert together, which culminated in yet another horrific event. A woman driving along I-90 about 3 hours from Dixon noticed a young woman walking barefoot along the highway, and it turned out to be Germaine. She was taken to a nearby police station where she reported that Michael had thrown her from their moving car while they were heading home from the concert. And as a result, Michael again was facing PFMA charges, but those charges were eventually dismissed. And when Michael was arrested for those particular charges, after throwing Germaine from a vehicle, I think she saw this as an opportunity to get her kids back, to finally kind of get a little bit of stability, and she apparently had to go to Michael's parents to get them, and his parents initially told her no. Weeks later, yet another call was made because Michael got handsy with Germaine, and again, when he was rejected, his form of punishing her was to take the kids. But unfortunately, because they had no custody agreement at all, there was nothing authorities could do to assist Germaine. Germaine was now stuck in this new and constant battle, constantly trying to jump hoops to make Michael happy, but the final card dealt was a significant blow. In the fall of 2017, Michael legally pursued custody of their children. Germaine had no money for an attorney. She lacked an understanding of how to represent herself, and because it was a civil case, the court would not appoint her any help. She entered that courtroom alone to face Michael, who had plenty of money, an attorney, and resources that she couldn't even dream of having. Michael's attorney allegedly portrayed Germaine as a drug abuser, someone who was not mentally stable or actively involved in her children's lives, and it's unclear what evidence, if any, Germaine brought forward to defend herself or to illustrate the history of violence in their relationship. Ultimately, the judge ruled in Michael's favor. Germaine was allowed to see her children from Monday through Wednesday and every other weekend. The court found that she didn't have a stable job or income, nor did she possess a stable home. But despite this, the judge also ordered her to pay $800 in child support, which is typically only demanded from individuals that earn at least $4,000 a month, which Germaine definitely didn't make. And honestly, I hope that judge that did that has to sit and think about that day in and day out, because that is absolutely wild to me. And so this loss sent Germaine into a deep depression. She made an attempt on her life, likely feeling like no one was on her side, not even the courts would protect her, and Michael allegedly continued to taunt her. He failed to provide information about their children, according to a Facebook post that she made. One of them had to go to the ER, and he wouldn't tell her why. I mean, it was just absolute torture for Germaine day in and day out. But eventually, she knew she had to pick herself back up. Germaine took on a second job at the Big River Cantina, which was a popular bar in Dixon, and she also decided to spend that following summer as a firefighter. She wanted to work on the rampant wildfires in the area, and this was something she was so incredibly excited about. And she was actually scheduled to begin training just after her sudden disappearance. Just weeks before her disappearance, she passed her drug test in preparation, which I personally find very interesting considering she had been smeared as a drug abuser in court when this drug test came back clean as a whistle. And she also found a new love interest through a dating app. And this love interest is Jacob from Missoula. Now, her family described Jacob as quiet and shy, and he seemed to bring this sense of calm to Germaine's life. But while all of these things were going great for Germaine, she was still playing this complicated game with Michael, still spending time with him on occasion to essentially negotiate an easier time with her kids. However, at this point, Michael was now engaged to another woman, so his attention seemed to be elsewhere. And given all of this detailed history that I just gave you, you can probably understand exactly why Germaine's family was horrified to hear that she went missing after spending time with Michael, her documented abusive ex-boyfriend. Germaine's grandmother, Vicky, started to frantically make calls to anyone and everyone she could to try and get information, and one of those calls was to a man named Nick, who worked at the Badlander bar Germaine was thought to last be at. Nick was able to confirm that Michael was in fact at the Badlander bar with Germaine just before midnight, and again, that's around the time that Jacob last spoke to her, and so sometime in that hour time frame, Germaine went totally off the map. But according to Nick, she seemed in great spirits. She was talking about tattoos she wanted. So what on earth happened to her that caused her to vanish? Germaine's family started to reach out to homeless shelters and women's shelters, hospitals in Missoula to see if anything had happened to her, but all of their efforts yielded no leads. And so eventually they knew what they had to do. And that was reach out to Michael, considering he was potentially the last person to see Germaine. Michael told Germaine's family that they had visited actually a few bars that night, and when they finished up, Germaine asked to be dropped off at Orange Street Food Farm, which is a small market about a mile away from the bar. And he told Germaine's family that she wanted to be dropped off there to see a friend named Cassidy who lived nearby, which was very interesting to hear for Germaine's family because according to Jacob, Germaine was actually supposed to be going to his house to spend the night. So now it sounds like she may have been planning to see somebody else. What exactly was going on here? So according to Michael, he dropped Germaine off at around 1 a.m. and watched as she walked into the darkness. And out of nowhere, he expressed this regret, saying that he had this gut feeling that he should have followed her. And now that she was missing, he really wished he had. And so her family is again thinking, why did he have this bad feeling? Did he see something? Did he know something? Everything with Germaine's disappearance just already felt off from the get-go. So by Sunday, June 17th, when her family still hadn't heard from her, they reached out to the Flathead Tribal Police to report Germaine as missing. However, since she didn't disappear on the reservation, there was nothing that they could do for her family. Instead, they were told to contact the Missoula police instead. And if you've watched literally any of my MMIW videos, this is a common theme in every single one. Jurisdictional issues are one of the largest reasons why so many MMIW cases are not investigated in a timely manner. The delays that this causes are devastating. And so on Monday, June 18th, her family called the Missoula Police Department to finally report her as a missing person. However, yet again, there was a delay. Missoula PD told them that the family would have to come in person to make the report, which I don't know if that's a very common thing, but I've never heard that said before, at least in any of the cases that I've personally looked into. So another day later, Tuesday, June 19th, her family made the hour-and-a-half drive to Missoula Police Department only to feel as though nobody was taking the situation seriously. There didn't seem to be tentative plans for a search. There was no noticeable lack of urgency. Germaine was an adult. She was technically 23 years old. And on top of that, just Indigenous women going missing in general is not taken seriously. And so realizing they had to take matters into their own hands, they decided to act because if they didn't, they weren't sure anyone else would. By Thursday, June 21st, her family caught the attention of the Lifeguard Group, which is a nonprofit organization that typically seems to specialize in combating human trafficking, but they jumped in more than happy to help. That same day, almost a whole week after Germaine was last seen, there was finally an organized search for her. You guys, there's a reason 48 hours is called 48 hours. That period is so crucial to finding evidence, finding leads, and here they are, days beyond that, just now able to start an investigation. The Lifeguard Group printed out posters and began to hang them up all over downtown Missoula. They also spoke to several people in the area and the bars, hoping that someone had seen Germaine, knew her, something at least, and many of them did know Germaine. They'd actually seen her that Friday night, the 16th. Most people said that she seemed to be having a great time. She was playing pool, she was dancing. No one noticed anything really unusual or knew what may have happened to her, and no one had seen her since. The search continued throughout the day as they checked alleys and dumpsters, but ultimately Germaine was never found, and they initially went into that search believing they would probably locate her. On that same day, however, the Missoula Police Department finally filed a missing persons case and assigned a detective. So still, it took them a couple of days to get the ball rolling. However, the detective only went on to work on the case for a single day. And to the family's frustration, only did things that they had already done, like calling hospitals. There just seemed to be this overall lack of urgency, especially because after working the singular day, this detective went on a 3-day vacation, leaving this case stagnant during a critical time for efforts to be made. I mean, they'd already missed the 48-hour mark, and so now they're like, well, what is it to just wait a week and a half at this point? And that's such a crappy situation that is all too common. The lifeguard group, however, continued on with their search efforts. That Saturday, they held another search with volunteers and family members, but still they were just finding no trace of Germaine. And at this point, it became pretty clear that they needed more help. They needed a detective who would take this case seriously. So the lifeguard group reached out to Missoula detective Guy Baker, someone that they had worked with before and knew would actually investigate thoroughly. So it wasn't until June 26th, 11 days after Germaine went missing, that an actual investigation began. That is absolutely bonkers. Detective Baker immediately went to Germaine's boyfriend, Jacob, because again, when it comes to someone going missing or, a homicide, more often than not, statistically, it is by someone that you know. Stranger homicide, stranger abduction is just not nearly as common. And also, more often than not, it involves a partner. And so he wanted to make sure everything was fine with Jacob, that he didn't create some fake alibi of being out of town. And Jacob was really forthcoming with Detective Baker. He was able to provide the same story he had initially told Germaine's family and confirmed that Germaine was with Michael DeFrance, someone that she had been in a relationship with previously. He was also able to provide a solid alibi that he was 200 miles away. He was in no way, shape, or form involved with Germaine's disappearance. So at this point, at least one person was ruled out as being involved. Detective Baker then decided to go to Germaine's home to see if maybe there were any clues there. Did she pack things up and decide to just run off because she'd been having struggles in her life, because she didn't have full custody of her kids? I mean, there were a lot of different possibilities that he had to consider. But when he went to her home, it didn't appear she had taken any of her belongings with her. It seems she really had just gone out to a bar with her ex and then vanished into the night. So now he wanted to focus on the bars themselves to see if maybe anyone from there knew what Germaine's plans were for the night or noticed anything odd. Germaine and Michael had first been at the Golden Rose, a bar in downtown Missoula, and then they headed to the Dark Horse. And this seems to also be the first location where someone else reported seeing Michael and Germaine together. A bartender from the Dark Horse informed Detective Baker that Germaine and Michael arrived probably sometime around 10 p.m. that Friday night, and they sat at the end of the bar together. And they immediately noticed that there was kind of an odd dynamic between Michael and Germaine. Germaine spent most of her time on her phone, and it was clear to the bartender that Michael was not happy about it, which aligns with everything Germaine's family said about Michael having this huge issue with Germaine being on her phone, talking to other people. So it didn't seem like they were really engaging in a ton of conversation together. It was like they were there together, but not there together. And despite her evident disinterest in Michael, the bartender said that he continued to try to, quote, talk her up. So after they went to the Dark Horse, they then headed to the Badlander bar. This was a bar that Germaine actually frequented, so lots of people she knew were there. It wasn't a place that she was unfamiliar with. Several people at the bar confirmed that Germaine didn't appear to be intoxicated that night, nor did Michael, so it wasn't necessarily a situation of she maybe got drunk and lost or something along those lines. And they also confirmed that she seemed to be having a pretty good time. Germaine was her typical bubbly social self. However, Detective Baker wanted to obtain surveillance footage to see if maybe anything noteworthy had been captured, something that other people didn't pick up on or notice, or hopefully capture Germaine leaving, what time she left, and what direction she headed, and if anyone else went with her. Now, unfortunately, because so much time had passed, most of that footage was gone, but there was one camera located perfectly down the alley and toward the bar that still had footage from that night. The 2 hours of footage show Germaine moving from group to group. She was being her social self. But throughout the entirety of the video, one thing you also can't help but notice was Michael. Michael was just always standing a few feet behind her, looking less than pleased. Germaine's family actually was never given access to this footage. They couldn't see it until the 48 Hours episode aired, which I think was in October of 2024. So It was quite some time, and when they did, they shared some pretty big concerns that they saw in the footage. They claimed that Michael visibly grew irritated when Germaine spoke to other people that night. At times, he even stood behind her, like towering behind her, puffing out his chest, rolling up his sleeves, crossing his arms, and her family felt like it looked like an attempt to intimidate the men that Germaine was speaking to. So again, you've got this kind of controlling, possessive behavior that had been evident throughout the entire of their relationship, which is backed up by court records because that 40 hours he was supposed to go to domestic violence counseling had to focus on controlling behavior. And then right around midnight, Germaine can be seen walking away from the bar, and several feet behind her trailed Michael. They both disappeared into the night, out of camera view. So in this moment, Detective Baker realized he needed to speak to Michael himself, because this was just confirmation that he was likely the very last person to see Germaine. Michael willingly agreed to speak with authorities. He was completely cooperative. He also agreed to do it without an attorney present, and he even allowed authorities to search his truck, which he claimed was the last place that Germaine was with him. And then he went into the details about that night. He talked about the fact that they went out to bars, but the information that he gave regarding what happened after they left the Badlander changed from what he initially told Germaine's family. Now, some sources state that he confirmed with police that he dropped her off at Orange Street Food Farm initially and later changed his story, but other sources say that he changed his story from the get-go with police. Either way, he was now claiming to authorities that he dropped her off at South 5th Street West and Prince Street, which is not at all Orange Street Food Farm. It's actually a random area in the middle of a residential neighborhood 8 blocks away. So this raised the question, why did he change the location where he claimed to have dropped Germaine off? It's not like these two locations can be easily confused. They are very distinct, separate locations, but nevertheless, that was the information that detectives had to work with. And since he confirmed Germaine was dropped off at this place to meet someone named Cassidy, that became their next focus, was to identify this Cassidy person that Germaine allegedly was going to see. However, none of Germaine's friends or family ended up knowing anyone by that name. And ultimately, they found not a single bit of evidence that Cassidy was a real person. So then authorities were faced with another question. If she claimed she was going to meet someone named Cassidy, according to what she told Michael, why could they not find this Cassidy person? Who was she actually going to meet? And they actually found out there was a pretty easy answer to that question. Germaine actually frequented that specific neighborhood, but not to meet someone named Cassidy. It was actually where her boyfriend, Jacob, lived. And Jacob uncovered a possible explanation why Germaine might have falsely claimed to be meeting a non-existent female friend, even though I'm sure 90% of you can probably guess why all on your own. Jacob informed the police that he believed Germaine used the name Cassidy because she hadn't told Michael that she was seeing someone else. He was worried that Michael would probably not react well to the truth. Clearly, Germaine was worried about that as well, so she tried to keep it a secret that she was actually going to see a new boyfriend of hers. And he had even more information to further this belief. According to Jacob, the night before Germaine disappeared, which would have been June 14th, there was another incident involving Michael. The night of June 14th, Germaine and Michael attended a monster truck rally. This is what she told Jacob. This is what she told several family members. And just like she went on to ask the following night of June 15th, after the rally was over, she had Michael drop her off at Orange Street Food Farm. Jacob mentioned to authorities that Germaine's plan was to walk the few blocks to his house from the food farm, again, presumably so Michael wouldn't discover what was going on. However, as Jacob walked to meet Germaine, he saw her running through a back alley. It turned out that Michael and his fiance had split up about a week or two prior. There's not an exact date that I can find. And so during that car ride to the Orange Street Food Mart Thursday, June 14th, Michael started to demand to know if Germaine was in a relationship and said he wanted to get back with her. And I'm sure that kind of created a very scary, conflicting situation because little did Michael know he was actually driving Germaine to go see this boyfriend of hers that she didn't want him to know anything about. So ultimately, this led to an argument between Germaine and Michael. And so as a result, detectives naturally began to wonder if maybe something had gone wrong on the night of the 15th. Maybe Michael found out that Germaine was in fact dating someone else. Did Germaine silence her phone call with Jacob to try to stop Michael from seeing he called? Or maybe because she was in the middle of an argument with Michael? All of these possibilities were on the table, but it was also just as possible that something may have happened to Germaine in the few blocks between the food farm and Jacob's home. Maybe all of this was just a coincidence and someone else out there had horrible intentions and managed to be perfectly at the right place at the right time. And this became even more possible when authorities ended up receiving a terrifying tip. Two women from the reservation had attended a party around the time that Germaine went missing, and they saw two guys at this party they didn't recognize, and these guys were apparently talking about being involved in drug trafficking and mentioned being at the reservation to purchase girls. So it seemed like they not only were involved in drug trafficking, but also potentially human trafficking. The two women were so horrified and felt like they were potentially targets, so they got the heck out of there. And when news spread that Germaine was missing, they immediately went to authorities worried that maybe she became a target instead. While Montana isn't commonly listed among states with high trafficking rates, Missoula itself has one of the largest interstates in all of Montana running directly through it. And when you combine that with the surrounding reservations, which have numerous vulnerable women and children, Montana still experiences trafficking just like any other state. And the specific location she was at, from the Badlander Bar to Orange Street Food Farm, was in this very centralized location just minutes away from that huge interstate. So this didn't seem potentially that far-fetched. So Detective Baker jumped into action to see if this was really a plausible theory. He did successfully manage to track down the two men from the party, but it turned out to be a dead end. At the very least, if trafficking was involved, they weren't connected. However, the next piece of information ended up leading authorities right back to Michael. Detective Baker obtained Germaine's cell phone records to attempt to better figure out her last known whereabouts. They wanted to see where her phone was last active, and it should match up at least somewhere near the area that Michael claimed to drop her off, which was either this random place in the middle of a neighborhood or Orange Street Food Farm. But that's not at all what it ended up showing. Instead, it showed that an hour after she was allegedly dropped off by Michael, from 2 a.m. to 10 a.m., her phone was active and it was pinging off of a tower. However, this tower was in Evero, a town about 30 minutes away from where Orange Street Food Farm is and downtown Missoula. So now authorities are trying to figure out how on earth did Germaine, without a car, after being dropped off in the middle of a night in an area that she was familiar with but didn't have like a ton of people that she knew in, end up 30 minutes away in Evero. But then they realized a connection. Where Germaine's phone pinged put her as being in an area where Michael lived with his parents. So it turned out that the local Missoula Police Department were not the only ones investigating the case. The Sheriff's Department was actually also involved, and I don't know if they knew about this or if there's this, again, lack of communication between departments, but while Detective Baker had all of his warrants sealed and we know nothing about them, the warrants issued by the Sheriff's Department around this time are open for review. And it turns out that after this information was found, on June 27th, the Sheriff's Department applied for a warrant to search Michael's home for Germaine's belongings. Specifically, they wanted to find her phone since that's the last place that it sent off a ping. During this initial search of the DeFrance property, Michael was not at home, but his mother was, and she did willingly speak to officers. She claimed that Germaine had never been to their house before, which they found hard to believe just because Michael and Germaine shared children. I think this was probably a different place than where they initially lived, but she also said that Michael was still in love with Germaine and wanted to get back together with her, which just further corroborated what Jacob had said Germaine and Michael had an argument about the night before she went missing. Now, ultimately, no evidence was collected during the search. They couldn't find Germaine's phone, so now on to the next question: where the hell did her phone go? And the only person that might have an answer to that was Michael. So they brought him in for a second interview. Michael was confronted about the fact that Germaine's phone did not last ping where he said he dropped her off. Instead, it seemed to follow him home to his family's property where it was pinging from 2 a.m. to 10 a.m. And so they asked him, how the hell is this happening? Why is her phone being seen last near your property. And Michael provided them a very interesting story. Michael had apparently, in all of his conversations with authorities to this point, he had forgotten to mention to authorities that she had actually left her phone behind in his car, which seems like a pretty damn big thing that she would remember, being like, oh, by the way, I literally have her phone. She didn't have it. Maybe that plays a part in her disappearance. But I digress. And he told authorities that during that time frame, when her phone was active from 2 a.m. to 10 a.m., he had apparently repeatedly tried to unlock her phone, but was unsuccessful in his attempts. And so their next obvious question is, okay, so you had her phone, which is weird in and of itself. You failed to mention that to us, and then you were trying for hours to get into it. Where is the phone now? And this is where, things just take a real weird turn, okay? Michael proceeds to tell authorities that 2 days after she disappeared, he decided to get rid of her phone. And so they're like, okay, that's not suspicious at all. Where did you get rid of it? And again, takes an even weirder turn. Michael admits that he drove across state lines into Idaho, down Highway 12, and threw her phone over an embankment into a rushing river at mile marker 94. I try to be a very neutral party. I try to really look at things from all different perspectives. And most people that would have someone accidentally leave their phone in their car, especially when you have a custody agreement, that means you regularly see each other, you're probably going to keep that phone and give it to said person. You're probably not going to decide to throw it away, first of all options, and not even that, throw it away into a river off of an embankment of a highway in another state, okay? I legitimately don't think you can get any sketchier than that. I really would love to hear what his logical explanation behind doing that was. Like, why does he claim it is normal for him to have done that? And so obviously, searchers were sent out to that specific area to look for Germaine's phone. But as expected, considering it was thrown over a huge rocky embankment towards a river, no one was able to locate it. By July 13th, the sheriff's office ended up applying for a second warrant. And this time, it provided a little bit more insight into what they believed might be happening in Germaine's case. The sheriff's department indicated that they had reason to believe an illegal act had been committed. And the illegal act they put down on paperwork was unlawful restraint. They believed someone was holding Germaine captive. This warrant that they requested was actually to access Germaine's EBT card to check her purchases around the time she vanished, before, during, after. And it makes me wonder if they suspected someone was maybe using her card to buy items to feed her while keeping her hostage. Again, that is my pure speculation because it's impossible to say for certain as it wasn't really stated. The warrant also specifically referenced the concerns that Germaine's family and Jacob had regarding the possibility that Michael found out Germaine was dating someone else, especially since previous police reports involving domestic disputes between Germaine and Michael. Germaine told authorities Michael had several times stated to her that if he couldn't have her, no one will. But whatever they ended up discovering through these warrants was never made public. And on August 1st, a third warrant was issued to investigate Michael's Google account. Specifically, it seems that the sheriff's department wanted his location data. He'd already been interviewed again. He willingly agreed to allow authorities to examine his phone. They extracted data, so he was still being cooperative. However, they wanted the Google warrant to provide them with more specific details about his whereabouts that night. Google location will track legitimately your every movement down to like the specifics. It's not like a phone ping where you have a certain radius that the person may be inside of. And they were able to confirm that Germaine's phone and Michael's phone were in close proximity that whole night. That time from 2 a.m. to 10 a.m. when Germaine's phone was pinging, Michael's phone was right nearby. Not only that, but Jacob had been right. When Germaine's phone rang a few times, then went to voicemail around 1 a.m., the provider was able to confirm that someone had in fact declined that call. So between that and whatever this very specific Google location data uncovered, it had to have been something significant because on August 2nd, the following day, a fourth warrant was issued. And this warrant no longer mentioned unlawful restraint. Instead, the sheriff's department very blatantly stated that investigators believed Germaine's disappearance now involved deliberate homicide. That's huge. Now, this specific warrant was pretty extreme. They requested a warrant for 10 days of surveillance of the DeFrance's 10-acre property. And they specifically said they wanted to deploy drones and thermal imaging to map every single nook and cranny of the land. They were specifically searching for storage areas, bunkers, hidden buildings, and even suggested that Michael might visit a potential grave site or a location where evidence was being concealed. And so it really does seem that at this point, they're pretty certain about the direction of this investigation. However, it remains unclear if this search ever actually occurred, if they were ever able to bring in drones, if they were ever able to get thermal imaging. Honestly, that is kind of a big ask, so I wouldn't be surprised at all without further evidence that that request was denied. But again, we just don't know, because at the time, other than just odd behavior from Michael, there wasn't any evidence strongly indicating that he did anything wrong. Tensions at this point were really rising among everyone involved. Germaine's family began to publicly question Michael about several issues. There had been numerous searches at this point to take place, but he hadn't attended a single one. And even if Germaine and Michael were not in a relationship anymore, they still had 2 kids together. Their sons were missing their mother, and so her family expected him to play a part in looking for her. But Michael immediately came back and said that he was actively assisting in the investigation. He was just doing it independently alongside authorities. They also questioned why Michael had even been with Germaine that night, and I find his answer very interesting. Michael allegedly publicly stated that he was with Germaine to help her get back on her feet and get sober so that she would give a damn about her children. However, those that knew Germaine were aware how much she loved her kids, and her recent clean drug test indicated that this narrative Michael seemed to continue about a struggling addiction was very, very misleading. He had used it in court, he was using it now, but I mean, they have legitimate proof that she was not addicted to drugs like he was claiming. She had used drugs a handful of times in her life, like there was no denying that, but he was painting a picture that just was not the reality. And to top it off, Germaine was in one of the best phases of her life. She was about to start a career in firefighting. She was in a healthy, stable relationship. She was earning money from several jobs. And then to round it all out, who the hell takes someone to 3 bars claiming to help them get sober? Like, the whole story that he gave just wasn't adding up. And then in October of 2018, something pretty big happened, and they really seemed to expect something to come from it. The DeFrance property was finally searched, like the entire property, by Missoula Police Department. Now, according to Missoula PD, they had waited this long because they were trying to obtain specific cadaver dogs from the FBI. This has caused significant frustration and concern just across the board. A lot of people don't understand why they had to wait that long. There's been just a lot of contradictory information, and obviously the huge worry, again, about potential loss of evidence during the delay, because we're now talking months after Germaine was last seen. And while many details of this search are undisclosed, it does appear that some form of evidence authorities had led them to a specific location on the property, where several personal items were discovered. Now, it was never said whose personal items they were, so we don't know if they belonged to Germaine, Michael, the kids. I mean, there's no telling. However, upon examining these items, investigators found blood. I guess the cadaver dogs picked up on these items, and so all of them were sent to the crime lab for analysis. And it did in fact confirm the presence of human blood, but the results regarding whether it belonged to Germaine or not came back as inconclusive, which was just such a huge blow. I feel like this was the first time they felt they were going to get really solid information to support a theory that they'd been chasing for a very long time, but it just didn't come. And so at this point, it seems that investigators really hit a dead end. The investigation continued, but Germaine was not in the media very much. She hadn't really been in the media a lot to begin with, just given the fact she's an Indigenous woman. It's not covered heavily. But then along came Connie Walker. Connie Walker is an Indigenous woman, and she created the Stolen podcast to delve into Germaine's case. And she did an absolutely incredible job, and majority of this information you're hearing here came directly from her and her investigative efforts. She was able to go to Dixon and Missoula for a couple of weeks, talk to a bunch of people, connect a bunch of dots. So if you want to hear an incredibly detailed version of this case, definitely go and check out the Stolen podcast, search for Germaine. Now, in her conversations that Connie Walker had with Guy Baker, he claimed that they were close to taking the next step in the investigation. And this podcast started in 2021. So it seems like while things maybe were stagnant in the media and it didn't seem like much was going on, according to Guy Baker, in the background, they were making moves. And it sounded like maybe maybe they were getting ready for an arrest. He even confidently asserted that he knew who was behind what happened to Germaine, like just straight up said it, and even suggested that more than one person may have been involved in her disappearance. Baker shared similar sentiments during an interview with 48 Hours, but still, despite this talk, no arrests have occurred, and we are now in 2025. And on top of that, not a single suspect has been named, including Michael. Despite all of this really heavy, focused efforts into investigating him and very strange things regarding his potential involvement in her disappearance, he has not a single time been named a suspect in her case. They just don't have the evidence to support that. I can't help but think about the 11 days before anyone decided to look into Germaine's disappearance. 11 days that allowed someone involved in her disappearance to potentially clean up after themselves. And then the lengthy delay that it took before they were able to search the DeFrancis property. I mean, they so strongly said they believed this was a deliberate homicide and wanted to search the property. I believe this directly explains why there is so little evidence. Most of what might have existed was likely searched for too late. And I don't want to sound like I'm totally trashing the efforts into Germaine's disappearance, because efforts were there. But when you miss that crucial time period exactly after disappearance, inevitably things will be gone. And it doesn't matter how hard you work after that, sometimes those missing pieces were the key pieces, and now you may never find them. Germaine's family has continued to search for her alongside Detective Baker and the lifeguard group. They have not given up. They have searched a significant portion of Evero, but the challenging terrain has made this a very slow process. There's lots of flowing rivers, there's lots of wooded terrain, cliffs, rocky areas, and they have compared it to looking for a needle in a haystack. And even though her phone's last known location was in that area, unless there's information that authorities haven't shared, it's also possible that she herself actually wasn't there. What if it was just her phone and she is somewhere else? If she did get out of the car, like Michael stated, and she did leave her phone, and we totally overlook his subsequent suspicious behavior and the several warrants indicating there was suspicious behavior found even further by authorities, it would suggest that she ventured out into the dark without her phone. And if something happened or she was unable to enter Jacob's house, she would have been even more vulnerable with no way to call for help. And while I will absolutely play devil's advocate, all of the warrants and things that authorities have done during the investigation just doesn't indicate they believe or have evidence to support that something like that is actually what happened. Germaine's family does not seem to have any contact with her sons. They're not even sure if her sons remember their mother, or if anyone in Michael's family is taking active steps to ensure that she is still a part of their lives. They've also fought to put up several billboards, and one of those is located on Highway 93 in Evero, very strategically. This highway Michael would have to take to reach Missoula, and so their hope is that seeing Germaine's face prominently displayed on this billboard will keep her memory alive for her sons at the bare minimum, that they will always be able to go down this road and see their mother. Additionally, it serves as a reminder to the public that Germaine may have last been in that area before she fully vanished. There's been a reward of $10,000 for information related to Germaine's case. I don't know if that is still active. Detective Baker has stated that he strongly believes they're either going to need to find a body or someone will have to confess in order to solve this case. Now, after the Stolen podcast released several episodes in 2021, it seems that there was a lot of pressure put on Missoula Police Department to solve this case, and it seemed that it potentially put enough pressure on them to arrest Michael, although it wasn't exactly directly related to Germaine's case. Michael ended up being arrested in 2021, and the affidavit listed dates from the search of his home back in October of 2018. So what on earth happened at the home in 2018 that would lead to his arrest in 2021? Well, it turns out that federal law prohibits anyone convicted of domestic assault from owning firearms, and during that search, they found several guns in Michael's possession, and he admitted to several of them belonging to him. Some of them were in the home, and some of them were in his truck. Now, for whatever reason, they didn't arrest him then and there, which I personally find an interesting thing to do, just because If they wanted to kind of push him in a corner and get answers out of him, if they felt he had information he wasn't giving forward, you would think that would have been an opportunity they were going to jump on. And now, given the pressure, they decided to proceed with charges. Guy Baker went and arrested him on federal firearms charges, 4 of them to be exact. Michael was facing a maximum of 10 years in prison, I think like a $250,000 fine, if not more. It's not really clear what they thought they would gain from this, other than just charging him for something 3 years later. Detective Baker did say that he felt it would open possible further investigative efforts that might uncover more evidence when it comes to Germaine's case. Now, Michael's attorney fought pretty hard to have state laws supersede federal laws. All of these attempts were dismissed, and so in April of 2023, Michael was found guilty of 4 firearms charges, including prohibited possession of firearms and 3 counts of making false statements. He had knowingly checked a box indicating that he hadn't been convicted of any misdemeanors involving domestic violence 3 separate times at pawn shops. Now, ultimately, it doesn't seem like this really provided any new information in Germaine's case, but when I was looking through some of the court documents, I feel like it just revealed something else very interesting, in my opinion. Now, in order to uphold the federal law, it had to be proven that there was, in fact, domestic violence involved in the relationship between Germaine and Michael. And not only that, they had to solidly confirm that Germaine would be considered a partner. And so as a result, several people from Germaine's life and Michael's life were called to testify. Germaine's family was able to provide a pretty clear picture of their relationship leading up to the first 911 call in April of 2013 to the courts. However, in the testimonies of Michael, his mother, and his father, they attempted to assert that Germaine's family was being untruthful and that none of these incidents occurred, that all of this information down to Germaine living and staying at the home of Michael and his family was false. But the court ultimately found that the testimony from all 3 of them lacked credibility, and they stated it several times throughout this court document to emphasize that none of their testimony could be trusted. Quote, "This testimony is not credible based on witnesses' manner while testifying, other evidence contradicting the witness's testimony, and the reasonableness of the witness's testimony in light of all the evidence." Some of Michael's mother's testimony in specific was even stated to be, quote, "contradicted by voluminous evidence, including her husband's testimony and her own testimony on cross-examination." Further noting, quote, "The court finds that the entirety of Jennifer DeFrance's testimony lacks credibility." What this entire document says to me personally is that they all took the stand and blatantly lied to the courts to protect Michael. And I think that that speaks volumes. Now, ultimately, Michael was sentenced to 21 months, which is a significant reduction from the 10 years he was facing. And in December of 2024, so just over a month ago, his conviction was ultimately overturned. The U.S. Court of Appeals found that his conviction under the Montana statute was not sufficient for him to be charged under federal law. And so his case has now been sent back to lower courts for resentencing. So I guess we'll see what happens with that. There needs to be consistent conversations about Germaine's case. This pressure needs to remain on the police department to find answers. And in the meantime, Germaine's family has focused a lot of their efforts on preventing similar situations from happening to anyone else. They realize that there's not a single thing they can do about whatever happened to Germaine, but they have to act. They have to do something to make sure this stops. They've collaborated with local authorities and the reservation to create a more unified response to missing persons cases. And I believe they're among the first in the nation to establish a community plan for scenarios like Germaine's, which is huge. This plan aims to eliminate the confusion of handling cases across different jurisdictions, fostering better communication between them, and then ideally leading to a faster and more efficient response, something that could have made all the difference in Germaine's case. In the end, Germaine is still missing. On the night of June 15th, something happened that left her 2 boys growing up without their wonderful mother. Her family remains hopeful and vigilant, determined that Germaine will be found and that her story will inspire others rather than her be just another statistic. It is important to remember that each statistic does in fact represent a life, and beyond that, it signifies a family that has been profoundly impacted, as well as yet another generation that's going to carry the same trauma. We have to keep on speaking up, demanding change, and a push for better resources to address this violence affecting MMIW. I want to ask ask you guys to really take some time to educate yourself on what's happening, why it's happening, and what has to be done to stop it. And in the meantime, share these stories to ensure that their voices are heard and valued. Germaine is one in many, and her case is getting more attention than probably 98% of all the other cases will. So keep that in mind and help do something to change that. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and go, you guys. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Germaine's story. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.